A true story of survival, leadership, and the unthinkable. Imagine a place on Earth so hostile, so utterly devoid of mercy, that it swallows entire ships whole, not in a sudden storm, but in a slow, suffocating grip of ice. A place where the sun sets for 4 months, leaving behind a cold, moonlit darkness that feels like the end of the world. Now imagine a man who, against all rational thought, took 27 others directly into that abyss, only to bring every single one of them back alive. This is the true, astonishing story of Sir Ernest Shackleton and the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition of 1914. A story not of a glorious triumph over a continent, but of the most monumental failure in exploration history that became the single greatest triumph of human survival. Settle in. Let the chilling vastness of the Antarctic ice shield the noise of the world, and let us begin this astonishing journey. Part 1. The Lure of the Unbroken Path. The year was 1914. Europe was a powder keg, the fuse already smoldering, but in the mind of Ernest Shackleton, one grand goal eclipsed the rising tide of global conflict. The Antarctic continent remained unconquered. Robert Falcon Scott had reached the South Pole just 2 years earlier, only to find the Norwegian flag of Roald Amundsen already planted there. Scott and his entire party perished on the return journey, a tragic end to what was, fundamentally, a race won by another man. The heroic age of Antarctic exploration was closing, and Shackleton, already a legend from his previous near-successful dash for the pole, knew he needed a final, definitive stroke of brilliance to etch his name into history. The North Pole had been reached. The South Pole had been reached. What was left? The last great polar challenge, a complete crossing of the Antarctic continent, from a jumping-off point on the Weddell Sea, across the pole itself, and out onto the Ross Sea, a distance of approximately 1,800 miles. He called it the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition, and his ship, the Endurance, was named with a single, prophetic word. In his advertisement for a crew, Shackleton penned one of the most famous and perhaps most misleading job listings in history. Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. The response was overwhelming. More than 5,000 men applied. Why? Because Shackleton was not just an explorer, he was a living myth. He was the boss, a man of boundless, almost manic optimism, whose sheer force of will had, in previous expeditions, pulled men back from the brink of certain death. To serve under Shackleton was to be part of an adventure that transcended the mundane. He assembled a crew of 27 men. They were a mix of seasoned sailors, scientists, a physician who was also an amateur entomologist, a stowaway who was eventually accepted, and a rough-and-ready Australian carpenter named Harry McNish, who brought along his mischievous ship's cat named Mrs. Chippy. This unlikely family was about to face a nightmare that no previous explorer had ever imagined: the last harbor. On August 8, 1914, 2 days after Great Britain officially entered the Great War, the Endurance slipped out of Plymouth Harbor. Shackleton himself delayed his departure to offer his ship and crew to the Admiralty for the war effort. The First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, sent a telegram back with a single word: proceed. It was a haunting choice. While the world descended into mechanized slaughter, 34 men were heading south to face the primal forces of nature, unknowingly trading the shells of battle for the teeth of the pack ice. The Endurance was a marvel of shipbuilding, 144 feet long, 3 masts, and, crucially, one of the strongest wooden ships ever built. It was constructed of oak, greenheart, and Norwegian fir, with a hull thickness up to 25 inches in places, designed, they believed, to withstand the pressure of the ice floes. They sailed first to Buenos Aires, then down to the whaling stations of South Georgia, the last outpost of civilization before the Antarctic Circle. On December 5, 1914, the Endurance steamed out of the bay at Grytviken. The smell of whale oil and the sight of distant, jagged peaks, the last scents and sights of the human world they would encounter for nearly 2 years. Their target was the coast of the Weddell Sea, where they planned to land and begin the Great March. But the Weddell Sea had a reputation. It was a chaotic, churning mass of ice floes, notorious for trapping and crushing ships. Within 2 days, they saw the first evidence of that reputation. The jaws of the ice. The first icebergs appeared, towering, cathedral-like structures that glowed with an eerie blue light. These were majestic, but the real threat was the pack ice, a constantly shifting, seemingly endless mosaic of frozen seawater. Initially, the Endurance made excellent progress, Shackleton skillfully navigating through the leads, channels of open water between the ice. But as they pressed deeper, the ice grew thicker, the leads narrower, and the progress slowed to a crawl. They were racing against the seasons. They needed to find a safe winter harbor on the continent before the full Antarctic winter clamped down. On January 19th, the sun was still high, yet they entered a field of ice so dense and unforgiving it was described by one crew member, Frank Worsley, as cemented in. They had penetrated deep into the Weddell Sea, but now the ice was moving. 2 enormous opposing ice floes had begun to grind together, and the Endurance, for all her boasted strength, was caught in the middle. They were fast. Not fast in speed, but fast in the sense that they were stuck, held prisoner by the shifting, frozen prison. Shackleton ordered the engine killed to save coal. They were only 60 miles from their intended landing site. The boss remained outwardly optimistic, ordering a routine of sports and exercise on the ice, hoping to keep morale high. He knew, however, that the grip of the pack was rarely broken until the spring thaw, a thaw that was still 8 months away. They were now a tiny, vulnerable speck of wood and canvas frozen solid in a colossal white desert. The world was at war, but their own private struggle had just begun. The incredible, unthinkable truth was this: their journey was over before it had even begun. The crossing was impossible. All that remained was the fight to survive. Part 2. The Long Night and the Dying Ship. The Endurance had been stopped dead in the ice on January 19, 1915. Shackleton, ever the pragmatist beneath his cloak of boundless enthusiasm, soon realized their situation was critical. The Antarctic summer was waning, and the ice was not going to release its grip. They were trapped, adrift in one of the most unpredictable and dangerous bodies of water on Earth. They were in the Weddell Sea, a vast, clockwise rotating current that was slowly carrying them northwest, away from the continent and towards the hostile, chaotic region of the South Atlantic. Shackleton's ambition of the trans-Antarctic crossing was now a frozen fantasy. His single, immediate goal became survival. Life aboard the prison ship. Shackleton, recognizing that idleness was the enemy of morale, instituted a strict and varied routine. The ship, which was now effectively their fixed base, was converted into a floating laboratory and home. Science continued. The scientists, including the meteorologist Leonard Hussey and the biologist Robert Clark, were tasked with carrying on their observations, taking temperature readings and collecting biological samples through holes drilled in the ice. This gave purpose to the scientific contingent and maintained the expedition's intellectual facade. Physical activity. Every day the men were required to exercise on the immense flat ice floe surrounding the ship. They played hockey with improvised gear, raced the sled dogs, and even held mock football matches. The dogs, which were their most crucial asset for the march that never happened, were housed in insulated kennels on the ice itself, known as the dogloos, and they were exercised constantly by their keeper, the rugged Frank Wild. The comfort of routine. Meals were scheduled precisely. Though rations were generous initially, Shackleton kept meticulous track of stores. Evenings were dedicated to reading. The ship's small library was heavily utilized, and to sing-alongs, led by Hussey on his banjo, an instrument which would soon become a priceless psychological tool. They had been frozen in at 69 degrees 05 minutes south latitude. For 3 months, the Endurance endured. The pressure from the surrounding ice would ease and then return with shuddering force, occasionally tilting the ship precariously or creating pressure ridges, jagged, unstable mountains of ice that rose with a terrible groan. The ship creaked, groaned, and popped like a tormented beast, but her thick, strong hull held firm. The endless night. On May 1st, 1915, the sun finally dipped below the horizon for the last time. The long Antarctic night had begun, plunging the men into 4 months of perpetual twilight and darkness. The temperature plummeted, often dropping to -30 degrees Fahrenheit, or around -34 degrees Celsius, or lower. During this period, Shackleton excelled as a leader. He was not merely a commanding officer, he was a master psychologist. He ensured every man felt important and occupied. He held lectures on diverse subjects and encouraged personal projects. Crucially, he managed the social dynamics. He knew that in such close confinement, petty grievances could escalate into destructive conflict. He instinctively grasped the need for a strict social hierarchy, while paradoxically ensuring all men felt equal in the face of the overwhelming threat. The hierarchy was maintained, but the spirit was communal. Shackleton ate and lived much like the men, but always kept a small, necessary distance to maintain authority. The long night was a psychological endurance test. The cold was a constant physical presence, but the darkness and the profound isolation were the true enemies. The only sounds were the howling wind, the intermittent howls of the dogs, and the terrifying, grinding noise of the moving pack ice, a noise they learned to dread. The slow crush. In July and August, the ice pressure increased dramatically. Shackleton moved most of the provisions and sledging gear onto the surrounding floe as a precaution. They were now around 65 degrees south, still drifting. On September 30th, 1915, the men awoke to a pressure event far worse than any they had yet encountered. The ice did not merely squeeze the ship, it began to destroy it. Massive floes surged against the port side of the Endurance with an unbelievable force. The sounds were horrifying, a terrible, rending, shattering cacophony. Frank Worsley, the captain, wrote that the ice ground against her side, then crunched and crumpled like dry leaves. A piece of ice the size of a small car rose up and punched a massive hole in the ship's side. The ship's sturdy structure, built to withstand a siege, was finally breached. Water poured into the hold. The pumps were manned immediately, but it was a losing battle. The ice was moving too fast, too violently, and the damage was too severe. Shackleton knew the end was near. For 3 weeks the men fought valiantly. They used cement, oakum, and every material at hand to try and stem the flow. The ship's internal machinery was destroyed as the hull buckled. Shackleton kept up the fight to prevent the crew from falling into despair, but on October 24, 1915, the ice delivered the final fatal blow. The pressure ridges surged again, lifting the entire ship out of the ice, tilting it at an angle, and then squeezing it midships like a vise. The deck beams splintered, and the hull finally twisted and broke its back. At 5 p.m. on October 27th, Shackleton gave the inevitable order. He gathered his men on the ice and told them with heartbreaking finality, "She's going, boys. Abandoned ship." The men scrambled to retrieve essential gear, but the Endurance, their home, their sanctuary, and their only link to civilization, was irrevocably doomed. They watched as the water poured into her, turning the ship into a pathetic, broken shell. Shackleton ordered his photographer, Frank Hurley, to salvage the irreplaceable photographic plates documenting the journey. Hurley saved only about 120 key images, sacrificing hundreds more, smashing them to prevent the temptation of trying to save too much. Every ounce counted now. The wreck of the Endurance remained tilted in the ice for a few more weeks, a haunting memorial to their failed ambition. On November 21, 1915, she slipped beneath the ice with a sigh, her masts vanishing into the frigid depths. The 28 men were left standing on a massive, unstable ice floe, miles from any land, with 3 lifeboats salvaged from the wreck, a handful of supplies, and 69 dogs. Their location? Approximately 68 degrees south latitude. They were now truly alone, utterly dependent on Shackleton's leadership and their own ability to endure. They had traded a prison ship for a floating prison. The real journey, the desperate 500-day struggle for life, had just begun. Part 3. A speck of humanity on a drifting floe. With the sinking of the Endurance, the 28 men found themselves facing a stark and immediate reality. They were marooned on a massive, unstable slab of ice, carrying only what they could physically pull. Their ultimate goal was no longer the trans-Antarctic crossing. It was to reach a habitable piece of land before the ice floe beneath them broke up entirely. Shackleton immediately established Ocean Camp. It was a temporary base established on the largest, most stable section of the ice floe. The retreat from the sea. Their immediate need was to retrieve the lifeboats, which represented their only true hope of future escape. They dragged the 3 heavy wooden boats, which they named the James C. Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills, onto the ice. Shackleton knew that to survive the vast distance to land, they needed to march, pulling the boats and supplies. He decided their best chance was to head toward Paulet Island, a small, desolate volcanic island about 346 miles to the northwest, where he knew a hut and emergency supplies had been left by an earlier Swedish expedition. On December 23, 1915, Shackleton gave the order to march. He had calculated the distance, the time, and the odds. The attempt to march was a brutal, catastrophic failure. They used 2 sledges to pull the James C. Caird and the Dudley Docker, the weight of which, along with the supplies, was immense. The surfaces were treacherous, sometimes smooth ice, sometimes heavy, deep snow, and often mountainous pressure ridges that had to be scaled, chipped away, or detoured around. After 7 brutal days of back-breaking labor, pulling and hauling, they had advanced only 7.5 miles. Shackleton, recognizing the futility of fighting the chaotic, moving ice, called a halt. He realized that the ice floe itself was actually moving faster than they could march. They were using up precious calories and energy to fight a battle they could not win. Patience on the floe. Shackleton gave the order to establish a new semi-permanent base, called Patience Camp. They were now resigned to drift north with the ice for the duration of the summer, hoping to be released into open water once they reached the northern edge of the pack. Patience Camp lasted 4.5 months, from December 29, 1915 to April 8, 1916. This period tested Shackleton's leadership more than any other. The men were cold, wet, constantly on edge, and their spirits were fragile. The threat of scurvy was real, and the lack of fresh food and the perpetual dampness eroded their health. Shackleton instituted several key rules. 1. Equalization. Rations were distributed equally, with every man receiving the same portion. There were no special privileges for officers, reinforcing the bond of shared suffering. 2. Psychological distraction. The banjo player, Hussey, was encouraged to play every evening. Shackleton understood that music, however simple, was a vital lifeline to their previous lives and a break from the monotony of the ice. 3. The dog question. The dogs, which required substantial food, became an impossible burden. In late January, Shackleton made the agonizing decision to shoot the weakest dogs. The remaining ones were kept in peak condition for as long as possible. The final terrible order came in April. The remaining dogs and Mrs. Chippy, the ship's cat, had to be put down. This decision, though essential for conserving food, was a moment of profound heartbreak for the crew and a turning point toward the grimmest kind of survival. The rending of the raft. As the months passed, the floe drifted steadily north. In early April, they were down to about 62 degrees south, nearing the latitude of Cape Horn, the stormy and dangerous waters where the ice typically broke up. The sounds of the ice intensified. The constant groaning gave way to sharp cracks and shudders. Shackleton knew that once the ice broke up, they would be thrust into the open ocean. Their ice floe home was about to dismantle itself. With an odd insistence, the ice between them began to split and tear. On the evening of April 8, 1916, the ice floe that had been their home for nearly 6 months suddenly began to disintegrate violently. It broke into long finger-like fragments, sending torrents of freezing water rushing between the pieces. The men scrambled to secure the lifeboats and their essential supplies. Frank Wild, the second in command, was sleeping when the ice split right beneath his sleeping bag. He leapt up just as a gap of 3 feet opened up. They spent a terrifying night hopping from one piece of unstable ice to another, trying to find a floe large enough and solid enough to hold the entire party and the boats. Finally, they managed to haul the 3 lifeboats, gear, and themselves onto a new, smaller, and vastly more dangerous piece of ice. Shackleton ordered the immediate loading of the boats. The time had come to leave the treacherous embrace of the ice for the brutal unknown of the open sea. Their destination was the nearest land, the tiny, uninhabited Elephant Island, a rock 100 miles away that lay entirely exposed to the Antarctic storms. The 28 men, exhausted, soaked, and clinging to the sides of 3 tiny wooden boats, pushed off into the frigid, churning sea. Their next 3 stages would become one of the most incredible feats of navigation and endurance in maritime history.
Part 4. The Impossible Boat Journey. The transition from the relative stability of the ice floe to the chaotic violence of the open sea was immediate and brutal. Shackleton's priority was now navigating 3 fragile lifeboats through treacherous, ice-choked waters to reach Elephant Island. They pushed off on April 9, 1916. The conditions were horrific. The air temperature was barely above freezing, and the relentless, driving winds whipped the spray into a stinging ice coating on the boats and the men. The boats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills, were only 20 to 22 feet long, open to the elements, and dangerously overloaded with men, equipment, and dwindling rations. Each boat held 9 or 10 men, sitting rigidly to keep the weight balanced. They had no real shelter, only canvas salvaged from the Endurance to serve as a makeshift spray dodger. The sheer physical labor was exhausting. The men had to row constantly to prevent the boats from being swamped by the enormous swells. Worse, they were still surrounded by large pieces of floating ice, known as growlers and bergy bits, which could punch a hole in the thin wooden hulls with fatal ease. 5 days of hell. For 5 straight days, the men fought the sea. They were constantly wet, their clothes frozen solid, and the relentless lack of sleep became a form of creeping torture. The struggle to stay awake. The cold was so intense that men who slept risked freezing to death. Their feet and hands swelled and blistered. The near misses. On several occasions, huge breaking waves threatened to capsize the boats. Chief Frank Worsley, the captain and navigator, had to rely on quick, instinctive commands to keep the boats from being smashed. The dreadful thirst. Although they were surrounded by water, the seawater was undrinkable. Their limited freshwater supply was quickly depleted, and they were forced to ration it severely. Shackleton encouraged the men to eat small pieces of ice to maintain hydration, a painful act given their blistered lips. Shackleton, who navigated in the lead boat, the James Caird, was a pillar of energy. He moved among the men, talking to them, singing songs, and ensuring that no one succumbed to despair or the lure of sleep. He even forced food into the mouths of men too weak or depressed to eat. His presence was the sole thread holding the sanity and unity of the party together. Sighting land. On April 14, 1916, after 5 harrowing days and nights, a cry went up from the boats. Land! They had sighted Elephant Island, a bleak, mountainous, ice-capped rock. It was a desolate haven, but it was solid earth, their first sighting of land in 497 days since they left South Georgia in December 1914. But even reaching the island was a desperate struggle. Huge waves battered the narrow rocky shore, offering no safe place to land. They spent another terrifying night huddled near the island, waiting for dawn and a chance to land. Finally, they managed to beach the boats on a small, precarious spit of shingle and boulders on the island's northeast corner. The men staggered ashore, barely able to walk. Elephant Island was a place of utter misery. It was uninhabited, perpetually cold, and exposed to the full force of the Antarctic storms. There was no shelter, and the ground was largely composed of sharp, icy shingle. However, it was land, and for the first time in 17 months, the ground did not move beneath their feet. The men immediately collapsed. Many were frostbitten, nearly delirious from exhaustion, and suffering from acute stomach issues from the poor diet. 2 men were in particularly bad shape: Blackborough, who had severe frostbite in his toes, and Hudson, whose leg was infected. Within hours, Shackleton grasped the grim reality. Elephant Island was too remote, too cold, and too far south of shipping lanes. No one would ever find them there. They had survived the ice and the open boat journey, but now they were stranded on a rock that was merely a slightly slower death sentence. Shackleton knew he had to leave this place immediately to save the rest of the crew. The desperate gamble. Shackleton called a meeting of his senior officers, Wild, Worsley, and the surgeon, Dr. Macklin. He laid out the terrifying plan. They would take one boat, the sturdiest and most seaworthy they had, and attempt to sail it 800 miles across one of the stormiest oceans on Earth to reach the closest inhabited place, South Georgia Island. This journey was an unprecedented act of desperation. It meant sailing an open lifeboat through gale-force winds and mountainous seas, navigating by instruments that were barely reliable, and aiming for a target the size of a matchstick in the vast ocean. Wild would remain in charge of the 22 men left behind on Elephant Island. Worsley, the navigator, would join Shackleton. They chose 4 other men for their boat handling and resilience, including the carpenter McNish, who was crucial for preparing the boat. The most seaworthy boat, the James Caird, was immediately prepared for the voyage. McNish, despite his internal struggle with authority, worked miracles, using wood from the other boats and seal blood to strengthen the seams and build a makeshift deck and high spray shield. On April 24, 1916, Shackleton, Worsley, and 4 other men boarded the tiny 22.5-foot James Caird. They left the remaining 22 men with a promise: "I shall come back for you." The James Caird was pushed off, setting sail on a voyage that naval historians would later call the most remarkable small boat voyage ever achieved. Their survival and the survival of the men left behind now rested on this single, impossible gamble.
Part 5. The Epic of the James Caird. The departure of the James Caird from the rocky beach of Elephant Island on April 24, 1916, was the true point of no return. Shackleton, Frank Worsley, the navigator, and the 4 crew members, Tom Crean, Harry McNish, John Vincent, and Timothy McCarthy, were attempting the impossible, traversing 800 nautical miles of the Southern Ocean to reach South Georgia, through the zone known as the Roaring Forties and Furious Fifties. Battling the ocean. The Southern Ocean is a funnel of open water where no continents impede the global flow of wind and current. Waves there are legendary, known to reach heights of 60 to 80 feet. Sailing a small, open lifeboat under these conditions was considered suicidal. The 6 men were crammed into the little boat, which had been roughly decked over with canvas and sealskin by McNish. The conditions inside were suffocating and perpetually wet, but it offered marginal protection from the sea spray that instantly turned to ice. The first days were a ceaseless struggle against huge seas. Navigation. Worsley's task was nothing short of miraculous. Due to the violent weather, he could only take a reliable sighting of the sun to determine latitude or a star for longitude on 4 occasions during the entire 16-day journey. The rest of the time, he had to rely on dead reckoning, estimating their speed and direction based on the tumultuous waves and winds. Any error, even a slight miscalculation, would mean missing South Georgia entirely and sailing into the featureless, empty Atlantic, certain death. The struggle with ice. Even this far north, they encountered floating ice, remnants of the Antarctic pack. The grinding noise of an iceberg passing close by in the darkness was a constant, terrifying reminder of their vulnerability. Constant bailing. The James Caird constantly took on water. The men had to bail tirelessly, day and night, to keep the boat from sinking beneath them. The water was so cold it burned their hands, which quickly became swollen and useless. The midnight crisis. On May 5th, about halfway through the journey, the James Caird encountered the worst storm of the entire expedition. Worsley described it as a wave the size of a small cliff. It was a rogue wave, a colossal breaker that appeared out of the murk and towered over their tiny craft. Before Worsley could turn the boat into the wave, it broke directly over the James Caird. The force of the wave was devastating. It completely filled the boat with freezing water, knocking the men senseless and burying the rudder. For a horrifying moment, the boat was completely submerged, wallowing deep in the sea, threatening to capsize or sink immediately. Shackleton, recovering quickly, roared the command to bail. The men, half-drowned and working in the dark, furiously scooped the icy water out with buckets and whatever containers they could find. It was only the buoyancy provided by the small space beneath the decking and the superb construction of the hull that saved them. They had survived what Shackleton later called the worst moment of my life. Landfall. By May 8, 1916, the men were at the limit of their endurance. Their clothes were rags, they were suffering from extreme thirst, and their hands and feet were severely frostbitten. McNish, the carpenter, and Vincent, the sailor, were near collapse, their bodies too ravaged by the cold to contribute. Shackleton used his last remaining reserves of brandy to revive them, a critical, life-saving measure. On the morning of May 10th, Worsley shouted that he smelled land. The scent of kelp and seabirds was an overwhelming perfume. Hours later, through a break in the driving mist, they saw the sheer, massive cliffs of South Georgia Island. It was a staggering victory, but the ocean was not done with them yet. Gale-force winds immediately threatened to smash the boat against the unyielding rocky shore. They spent a further 24 hours, terrifying hours, battling the seas along the coast, trying to find a safe harbor. Finally, on May 10, 1916, at a remote bay on the south coast, later named King Haakon Bay, the James Caird was successfully beached. The men, after 16 days of fighting the most fearsome ocean on the planet, stumbled ashore. The voyage was over. The 800-mile feat of navigation and endurance was complete, but their trials were not. The Trans-Island Trek. The crew was ashore, but they were on the wrong side of South Georgia. The whaling stations, their only source of rescue, food, and communication, were located on the north side of the island, separated from them by massive, unmapped, ice-covered mountains and glaciers that had never been crossed by human beings. Shackleton, Crean, and Worsley, recognizing that the three weakest men, McNish, Vincent, and McCarthy, were too ill to continue, decided on the final desperate act of the rescue mission. They would cross the island. On May 19, 1916, the three men, Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean, set off. They were dressed in threadbare clothes. Their boots had no soles. McNish drove screws into them to provide traction, and they carried only a few days' provisions and the banjo. They undertook a 36-hour, non-stop, 32-mile crossing of a towering, hostile mountain range that reached nearly 10,000 feet. They slid down crevasses, climbed ice walls, and navigated blinding fog and snowstorms. Worsley, who had just navigated a boat across an ocean, now had to navigate a mountain range based on rough sketches and instinct. At dawn on May 20th, 1916, they spotted the whaling station of Stromness Bay below them. They could hear the sounds of the distant steam whistle, the first sound of civilization in 522 days. They made a final reckless descent, sliding down a waterfall into the valley below. At 3 p.m., they staggered into the Stromness whaling station. The whalers, seeing three ragged, bearded, filthy figures stumbling out of the mountains, a direction from which no one had ever come, were stunned into silence. Shackleton simply introduced himself. "My name is Shackleton." The rescue was underway, but the most critical part of the promise remained unfulfilled. The 22 men left on Elephant Island were still waiting. Part 6. Waiting on the Edge of the World. While Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean were performing their heroic mountain crossing, the 22 men left behind on Elephant Island were fighting their own silent, desperate battle for survival. They had been left under the command of Frank Wild. Shackleton's steadfast second-in-command. The survival shelter. Elephant Island offered no natural protection. It was a bleak, wind-swept rock. Wild's first priority was to construct a shelter against the vicious, sustained blizzards that ravaged the island. Using the remaining 2 lifeboats, the Dudley Docker and the Stancomb Wills, and pieces of canvas and paddles, the men constructed an ingenious, low-lying hut. They inverted the boats and propped them up on rocks, creating a tiny, cramped but weatherproof space they called snuggery. All 22 men had to live within this small space, relying on their own body heat and shared suffering to keep from freezing. The conditions inside the snuggery were appalling. It was dark, damp, and smelled strongly of penguin and seal blubber smoke, which they used for fuel and cooking. But it was their only defense against the -10 Fahrenheit temperatures and continuous snowstorms. Their diet was utterly dependent on what they could hunt on the barren coast. Their primary sources of sustenance were penguins, mostly Adelie and chinstrap penguins, which they clobbed and ate, consuming both the meat and the eggs when available. Seals, primarily Weddell and elephant seals, which provided a dense, rich blubber for heating and fuel, and tough, dark meat. And seabirds. Various seabirds were occasionally caught. This diet, while providing enough protein to prevent starvation, was monotonous and heavily parasitic. The constant consumption of oil and fat led to severe digestive issues. Their health steadily deteriorated, though the fresh, raw meat did ward off scurvy. The enemy of time. The greatest enemy on Elephant Island was not the cold, but time, isolation, and the resulting psychological despair. They knew that their fate rested entirely on the success of Shackleton's voyage to South Georgia. Wild maintained the same strict routine Shackleton had established on the ice. 1. Strict watches. Guards were posted day and night to watch for the rare arrival of seals or penguins, and more importantly, to look for a rescue ship. 2. Rations. Rations were managed to the ounce, a necessity to stretch their meager supplies. 3. Routine. Wild encouraged activities, including singing and reading, though their library consisted of only a few water-damaged books. Wild made a famous promise. If rescue did not arrive by a certain date, around the turn of the Antarctic spring, they would try to sail for Deception Island, hundreds of miles away, on their own. This was a psychological tool, a goal to prevent the men from simply giving up hope. He never truly intended to attempt such a perilous voyage, but the prospect of doing something kept morale alive. A man in agony. While most men survived, one suffered terribly. Reginald James, the physicist. He spent weeks in a deep depression. However, the worst physical agony was endured by Perce Blackborough, the stowaway. His feet, frostbitten during the earlier boat journey, had become gangrenous. Dr. Macklin, the surgeon, assisted by McLeod, had to amputate Blackborough's toes, performing the surgery inside the cramped snuggery with minimal light, using chloroform sparingly, and employing their limited surgical tools in the most primitive conditions. The failed rescues. Meanwhile, Shackleton's efforts to reach them were constantly frustrated. After recovering in Stromness, he immediately attempted to charter a vessel for the 800-mile return journey, but the war had commandeered nearly all suitable ships. He attempted rescue 4 times. 1. First attempt, May 1916, with a borrowed whaling vessel, the Southern Sky, stopped 100 miles from Elephant Island by impenetrable pack ice. 2. Second attempt, June 1916, with a seal-hunting ship, the Instituto de Pesca No. 1, supplied by the Argentine government, stopped by ice again. 3. Third attempt, July 1916, with the schooner Emma, supplied by the Chilean government, stopped by severe winter ice. Every failed attempt was a hammer blow to Shackleton, knowing that every day of delay meant that his men were closer to perishing. He spent months tirelessly pleading, fundraising, and lobbying the governments of Chile, Argentina, and the Great Britain to provide a suitable ice-worthy ship. The final approach. Finally, in August 1916, Shackleton secured the services of the Chilean steam tug, the Yelcho, captained by Lieutenant Luis Pardo. This was a small, lightly equipped vessel, not designed for the Antarctic, but Shackleton was desperate. He left Punta Arenas, Chile, on August 25, 1916. The winter ice was breaking up, making the journey risky, but possible. On August 30, 1916, Pardo brought the Yelcho to the north side of Elephant Island. It was a cold, foggy day. Wild and the men, huddled in the snuggery, were suddenly alerted by a faint, unfamiliar noise. A watchman burst into the hut screaming, "Ship! Ship!" Wild, ever disciplined, refused to believe it until he saw it himself. He grabbed his small camp log and walked out. Through the swirling fog, he saw a ship approaching. On the deck of the Yelcho stood three familiar figures, waving frantically: Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean. Shackleton, through a megaphone, shouted the question that was on every man's mind. "Are you all well?" Wild shouted back the most magnificent answer in the history of survival. "All well, boss! All well!" Within an hour, every man, weak and emaciated but alive, was safely aboard the Yelcho. After 105 days on Elephant Island and 634 days since the Endurance left South Georgia, the entire party was rescued. Shackleton had kept his promise, pulling off a feat of leadership and rescue unparalleled in the annals of exploration. Every single man came home. Part 7. The Promise Fulfilled and the Legacy of the Boss. The sight of the Yelcho pulling away from the desolate beach of Elephant Island on August 30, 1916, marked the successful conclusion of the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition, not as a feat of discovery, but as the supreme achievement in survival. The return to a changed world. The Yelcho transported the 22 survivors and the 3 rescuers back to Punta Arenas, Chile. Their return to civilization, after 2 years isolated in the age of steam and radio, was startling. They had gone south in a world poised for the Great War. They returned to a world submerged in it. The news of their survival and the astonishing feat of the James Caird journey momentarily broke through the grim headlines of the war in Europe. The tale of Shackleton's leadership and the crew's tenacity was hailed as a powerful reminder of human fortitude in the face of overwhelming odds. Upon their eventual return to England, most of the younger men immediately volunteered for military service, eager to contribute to the war effort now that their private war with nature was over. The meaning of failure. Shackleton's expedition had failed in its stated objective. The trans-Antarctic crossing was never attempted. However, the saga of the Endurance defined an entirely new standard for leadership. His success was not in reaching a geographic goal, but in the unwavering commitment to the safety of his men. His leadership principles became legendary, studied today by military strategists, business executives, and psychologists. The power of psychology. Shackleton understood that morale was the most critical resource. He used music, Hussey's banjo, routine, and constant engagement to fight the insidious erosion of hope. The crucial role of humility. He knew his strengths and weaknesses, delegating tasks effectively and relying completely on experts like Worsley for navigation and Wild for second-in-command. Leading from the front. He always shared the hardships, never demanding more from his men than he gave himself, and often minimizing his own suffering. The ability to adjust the goal. He did not cling to the original mission. Once the Endurance was trapped, the goal instantly shifted to get everyone home alive, demonstrating unparalleled decisiveness and flexibility. The final triumph of the expedition was simple. Not a single life was lost. This remains the most profound achievement of the entire heroic age of Antarctic exploration. The last journey. Despite the war and the trauma of the Endurance expedition, Shackleton felt an irresistible pull back to the Antarctic. He saw the end of the heroic age and sought one final definitive achievement. In 1921, he organized the Shackleton-Rowett expedition aboard a small vessel, the Quest. Though Shackleton was already physically ailing, suffering from a weak heart and the long-term strain of his previous exploits, he pressed ahead. On January 5, 1922, the Quest was anchored in Grytviken, South Georgia, the same whaling station where the Endurance had departed years earlier and where the James Caird had landed. Shackleton suffered a fatal heart attack in his cabin, only 47 years old. The decision was made, with the approval of his wife, that the great explorer should remain in the place that so defined his life and his legend. Sir Ernest Shackleton was buried on a bluff overlooking the bay at Grytviken, eternally facing the wild, cold continent that once almost consumed him, but which ultimately made him immortal. The story of the Endurance is not just an astonishing historical adventure, it is a timeless testament to the unbroken spirit of humanity. It proves that in the deepest darkness, in the most hopeless cold, the true measure of a man's courage is not how far he can go, but how many he can bring back with him.
Part 8. The Aftermath and the Unbroken Legacy. The 27 men who returned with Shackleton were profoundly marked by their experience, carrying the scars and the glory of the Endurance saga. Their lives after the rescue were a complex mix of continued adventure, military service, and attempts to reconcile their extraordinary experience with the ordinary world. The immediate call to war. Almost immediately upon returning to England, many of the younger, able-bodied men plunged into the greater conflict of World War I, demonstrating the same resilience they had shown in the ice. Frank Wild, second in command, was commissioned as a lieutenant in the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve. After the war, he accompanied Shackleton on his final voyage aboard the Quest. After Shackleton's death, Wild returned to South Africa, where he attempted farming. He remained fiercely loyal to the boss until his own death in 1939. His ashes were eventually interred beside Shackleton's grave in Grytviken, South Georgia, fulfilling a silent bond of brotherhood. Frank Worsley, captain and navigator, immediately returned to active duty in the Royal Navy. He proved his navigation skills were not limited to a lifeboat, commanding a Q-ship, a heavily armed decoy merchant vessel, and sinking a German U-boat in 1918. He was highly decorated for his wartime service. He later pursued a career lecturing and leading further minor expeditions. Tom Crean, second officer, James Caird hero, who had been on 3 major Antarctic expeditions, returned to the Navy and served throughout the war. He was awarded the Albert Medal for his previous Antarctic bravery, a separate expedition from the Endurance. After retiring in 1920, he returned to his home in Ireland, where he quietly ran a pub called the South Pole Inn until his death in 1938. Dr. Alexander Macklin and Dr. James McElroy, surgeons, both served in the Royal Army Medical Corps on the Western Front and were wounded but survived the war. Dr. Macklin eventually returned to the Antarctic for Shackleton's final expedition. The lives of the grounded men. Others struggled to readapt to a world that seemed mundane after their high-stakes drama. Harry McNish, carpenter, James Caird hero, who had initially clashed with Shackleton over a minor mutiny on the ice floe, a vital moment of leadership where Shackleton reasserted his authority, was unfairly denied the Polar Medal, though his incredible work on the James Caird was essential to the rescue. He struggled with poverty for the rest of his life, often working on merchant ships and docks in New Zealand, where he died in 1930. The Shackleton-McNish relationship remains a great debate in leadership studies. Frank Hurley, photographer, his incredible photos and film footage, saved by smashing hundreds of plates to conserve weight, formed the most enduring visual record of the entire era. He served as an official photographer for the Australian forces in World War I. His dramatic, high-quality images of the Endurance remains one of the greatest feats of photographic conservation in history. He went on to have a distinguished career as a filmmaker and photographer. The quest for the wreck. For over a century, the wreck of the Endurance remained one of the great lost ships of maritime history, lying somewhere in the ice-cold, deep, dark waters of the Weddell Sea. The exact location of the sinking was meticulously logged by Frank Worsley. Shackleton's crew had estimated the position when the ship sank in November 1915, 68 degrees 39 minutes south, 52 degrees 26 minutes west. The Discovery, 2022. In February 2022, the Endurance 22 expedition set sail aboard the South African icebreaker S.A. Agulhas II. Using cutting-edge underwater autonomous vehicles, AUVs, the expedition spent weeks searching the area. The unveiling. On March 5, 2022, they found the wreck at a depth of 9,869 feet, 3,008 meters. The incredible surprise was the state of preservation. Because the wreck lies in waters that are too deep for scavenging marine life and too cold for the wood-eating organisms, Pterodonovalis, that destroy most wrecks, the Endurance was found to be almost perfectly intact. The ship's name, Endurance, was clearly visible on the stern, and it looked almost as if it had only recently sunk. The discovery was a profound conclusion to the Endurance saga, allowing the modern world to finally gaze upon the ship that had been the crew's home and their eventual sacrifice. The wreck remains protected as a historic site. The true story of the Endurance lives on not because Shackleton reached the South Pole, but because he returned with every one of his men, etching an unbreakable promise into history.
Part 9. The Unbreakable Promise and Eternal Legacy. The narrative of the Endurance expedition stands as the ultimate example of leadership and survival, defined not by what was achieved geographically, but by what was protected, the lives of the men. Shackleton's failure to complete the trans-Antarctic crossing became his greatest triumph. His commitment to bringing every single man home against all odds cemented his reputation not as the greatest explorer, but as arguably the greatest leader of the heroic age. The survival of the entire crew was due to a series of near-impossible feats. The James Caird, the 800-mile open-boat journey, navigated by Frank Worsley with just 4 sightings, remains unparalleled in maritime history. The Trans-Island Trek, the 36-hour non-stop crossing of the South Georgia Mountains by Shackleton, Worsley, and Tom Crean, was an act of raw physical and mental endurance previously deemed impossible. And Frank Wild's steadfast command. The 105 days spent by the 22 men on Elephant Island were a silent testament to discipline and hope, sustained by Wild's unyielding belief that Shackleton would return. Shackleton returned to the Antarctic once more in 1921 aboard the Quest, intending to lead one final expedition, though his health was failing. He died on a heart attack on January 5, 1922, while the ship was anchored at Grytviken, South Georgia, the very last harbor he had sailed from with the Endurance, and the place where he had finally found rescue after the James Caird voyage. He was buried in the Norwegian cemetery at Grytviken, his grave overlooking the vast southern ocean that had been the stage for his greatest drama. His final resting place perfectly encapsulates his spirit, a permanent fixture on the edge of the world he was so obsessed with.
The story of the Endurance is now a powerful cultural touchstone, particularly in the United States, where it is often studied. Leadership studies, Shackleton's method of managing morale, assigning purpose, and prioritizing his team's well-being over the mission's objective is a standard case study in leadership programs globally. The wreck's discovery in 2022 was a worldwide event, providing a tangible proof of the ship's fate and bringing a powerful sense of closure to the historical account. The journey of the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition serves as an eternal source of inspiration, a definitive real-life epic demonstrating that the capacity of the human spirit to endure is limitless, even when faced with the absolute zero of desperation.